Let's consider a mapped dataset whose data source has 10 elements that are indexable from 0 to 9. On the right side of the board, we have our trainer that's trying to train this model using batches of data from this dataset. Like we discussed in the intro in a previous video, this is where the data loader plays a part. The first thing our data loader needs is the ability to sample the dataset using a sampler. And this is needed because in a lot of cases, we don't want our model to learn sequentially from the data starting with the first instance and down to the last. In order to stay true to the IID assumption that most models go with, we need to have some way of sampling the data using some probability distribution. In our case, let's just assume a random distribution. In order to do this, the sampler will first ask the dataset, how many instances does it have? Here, the dataset answers with 10. This tells the sampler that it needs to randomly shuffle indices 0 to 9. This is just one way of sampling. The PyTorch data library has a couple of other samplers built in. And we can even write our own, and we'll see and do all of that in a later video. Let's say the trainer asks the data loader for a batch of data of size 3. The data loader still cannot do that. It needs a batcher or a batch sampler, as PyTorch calls it. The data loader asks the batch sampler for a batch of size 3. Batch sampler in turn asks the sampler for its next sample. The sampler responds with the index 6. Now the batch sampler asks the sampler for another sample, because remember, it needs to create a batch of size 3. And the sampler dutifully responds with index 9. A third invocation yields the index 0. The batch sampler takes this list of indices and hands it to the data loader. The data loader now gets the data at index 6 from the dataset. Next is index 9, and then finally index 0 completes the batch. The last thing the data loader needs to do is to collate these discrete instances of data into a form that can be used by the trainer. It does this with the help of the collate function, which, unlike the batch sampler and the sampler, which were objects, this is a function. The data loader calls the collate function with the discrete instances that it had obtained from the dataset, and the collate function then stripes these instances or collates them into a single multidimensional tensor. The data loader now hands this off to the trainer, which is now ready to start its training loop with its first batch of data. So we've covered a lot of ground here. To recap, the sampler talks to the dataset to create a shuffled sequence of indices. The trainer asks the data loader for a batch of samples. The data loader in turn asks the batch sampler, which collects a list of indices from the sampler. The data loader gets the data elements corresponding to these indices from the dataset and calls the collate function to stripe these into a multidimensional tensor, which it then hands back to the trainer.